Good morning, everyone. My name is Nadita Ramachala, and I'd like to welcome all the participants to today's webinar. So I will be your moderator for today, and today's session is being recorded, so you'll need to give your consent to continue. I'd like to thank all today's participants to celebrate World Day for Safety and Health at Work 2021, and we're pleased to have a session on the National Standard for Occupational Health and Safety. Please be reminded of the Zoom etiquette, which is shown on your screen now, and I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all our participants today. We're pleased to have you with us. And I will now turn you over to the manager for Metrology Division, Ms. Erica Carut, to deliver welcome remarks on behalf of TTBS's board and management.
Thank you, Nadita. And Ms. Petal John
Erica,
Behrens.
you can go ahead.
Thank you. Are you all hearing me?
Yes, we can. Good morning.
Yes,
Okay.
Erica.
Good morning. So,
Good morning.
Yes, we're hearing you loud and clear, Erica.
lovely. So, Ms. Petal John Behrens, Deputy Director, Legal, Occupation, Safety and Health Agency. Mr. Shazam Idu, Vice Chair of the Institution of Occupational Safety and Health, Caribbean Branch, and Chair of the National Technical Committee for Occupational Health and Safety. Dr. Mark Allen, Head, Occupational Health Unit, Ministry of Health. Mr. Christian Virgil, Senior Lecturer at College of Science, Technology, and Applied Arts of Trinidad and Tobago, COSTAT. Mr. Premichan Nandlal, Point Lisas Energy Association Member Representative. Ms. Annabelle C. Prasad, Safety and Health Inspector of the Occupational Safety and Health Agency. Members of TTBS's National Technical Committee for Occupational Health and Safety. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome. I am pleased to address you today as we join countries around the world in celebrating World Day for Safety and Health at Work 2021 under the theme Anticipate, Prepare, and Respond to Crises. Invest now in resilient occupational safety and health systems. TTBS, in its capacity as the national standards body under the Standards Act number 18 of 1997, is responsible for the development, promotion, and enforcement of national standards. One of the main objectives of national standards is to protect public or industrial health, welfare, and safety. In order to more effectively achieve these objectives, a memorandum of understanding was signed between the Occupational Safety and Health Agency, OSHA, and TTBS in September 2020, in alignment with key priorities of both organizations. The MOU focused on the establishment of a strategic partnership through data sharing on enforcement procedures, best practices, coordination of activities, technical upskilling, professional training, as well as collaboration in the review of relevant codes and practices, guidelines, technical guidance documents, and standards. On the occasion of a World Day for Safety and Health at Work 2021, we are pleased to collaborate with the OSH agency and other key stakeholders to strengthen our national occupational safety and health systems to build resilience through standards and their application by the public and private sector organizations. Today's webinar will focus on the enabling safe and resilient workplaces with the national standard TTS ISO 45001-2020, Occupational Health and Safety Management Systems, requirements with guidance for use. Since emerging as a global crisis in 2020, The COVID-19 pandemic has had profound impacts on physical and mental well-being of society. It has affected many aspects of work, from the risk of transmission of the viruses in workplaces to occupational safety and health risks that have emerged as a result of measures to mitigate its spreads. Shifts to new forms of working arrangements, such as the widespread reliance on virtual meetings, have, for example, presented many opportunities for workers, but also posed new occupational safety and health risks. I am pleased today to note that we have representatives of the following organizations participating in our panel discussions: from the Ministry of Health, from the OSHA, from ODPM, IOSH Caribbean Branch, COSTAT, and PLE. With today's World Day for Safety and Health at Work in mind, TTBS, by means of this webinar, takes this opportunity to raise awareness and stimulate dialogue on the importance of creating and investing in resilient occupational safety and health systems, which includes mitigating and preventing the spread of COVID-19 at workplaces through TTS ISO 45001-2020. Some more about the standard. This national standard is a modified adoption of the international standard ISO 45001-2018 and provides a framework to increase safety, reduce workplace risks, and enhance health and well-being at work, enabling an organization to proactively improve its OHS performance. TTS ISO 45001 is intended to be applicable to any organization, regardless of its size, type, and nature. While the standard requires that occupational safety and health risks are addressed and controlled, it also takes a risk-based approach to the occupational safety and health management system itself to ensure that it is effective and that it is being improved to meet an organization's ever-changing context. And there are few benefits of the ISO 45001 standard-based occupational safety and health management system. And we will have, this will also include determining the hazards and the OH and S risks, seeking to eliminate them or minimize their potential effects, and evaluating an organization's OH and S performance and seeking to improve it. In combination of these measures will ensure that an organization's reputation as a safe place of work will be promoted and can have more direct benefits, such as improving its ability to respond to regulatory compliance issues, reducing the overall cost of incidents, reducing downtime and the cost of disruption of operations, reducing absenteeism and employee turnover rates, and recognition for having achieved an international benchmark. Indeed, investing in a resilient occupational safety and health system can provide great benefits to any organization now more than ever. In conclusion, I once again extend a special welcome to our presenter, panelists, members of the National Technical Committee for Occupational Health and Safety, and especially our webinar participants. Your presence emphasizes the fact that you and the organizations you represent are playing a critical role in the development of a standards-conscious society with safe and resilient workplaces. I anticipate that you will benefit greatly from this webinar. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Erica. So we will now move on to Ms. Petal John Bereens, Deputy Director Legal at the Occupational Safety and Health Agency, to deliver a presentation on creating a safer industry in Trinidad and Tobago through the OSHA TTBS MOU. Petal John Berens is an attorney at law of approximately 21 years standing with considerable experience in both the private and public sector, which includes international organizations such as the UNFAO and the BG Group, and she's currently the Deputy Director Legal at the Occupational Safety and Health Agency. She began her career at the Solicitor General's Department, Ministry of the Attorney General, where she provided advice to various ministries, bodies, and departments of the government of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, and successfully represented the Attorney General and various bodies before the High Court and Court of Appeal. So I'd now turn you over to Petal to deliver the presentation.
Good morning, and thank you for that introduction, Dita. Thank you for having me on this auspicious occasion. I will take you through my presentation in 3 areas. About OSHA, so we'll show OSHA, the structure and relationship with the TTBS, the legislation in which would show the current legislation and the plans to improve on the existing health and safety law. And then we take to the last but not least, the MOU. About OSHA, OSHA's vision is to imprint occupational safety and health into the DNA of Trinidad and Tobago. Our mission is to elevate risk management, commitment to world standards, and accountability to safety across all industries, sectors, and staff in Trinidad and Tobago. The Occupational Safety and Health Authority and Agency has been in operation for approximately 14 years. Before the advent of OSHA, matters relating to occupational safety and health were dealt with by the Factories Inspectorate, which was established under the Factories Ordinance of 1948. The OSH Act came into effect in 2006 with Section 98 in 2007, and OSHA began operations in 2007. The OSH Act sought to implement comprehensive mechanisms for the enforcement and support of health and safety systems in the workplace. The establishment of the OSH Authority and the OSH Agency was geared towards public education, research, as well as effective enforcement of safety and health regulations. So the OSH Authority is pursuant to Section 65(1) of the OSH Act, and the composition of such is, we have a chairman, we have a deputy chairman, the executive director, 1 representative from the ministry responsible for occupational safety and health, that's the Ministry of Labor, 1 representative of the ministry responsible for health, which is health, a representative from the ministry responsible for energy, and a representative of the body responsible for standards in Trinidad and Tobago, which of course is the TTBS, including also a representative from the THA and 9 other members appointed by the minister after consultation with employer organizations and employee organizations and other organizations involved with activities related to any of the general purposes of the Act. I'll take you now to the functions of the OSH Authority. The functions of the OSH Authority are set out in the OSH Act under Section 66(1), and they are to assist and encourage persons concerned with matters relevant to any of the general purposes of the Act, to carry out research, the publication of the results of research, and the provision of training and information, and to encourage research and the provision of training and information in that connection by others. To ensure government departments, employers, employees, organizations representing employers and employees respectively are provided with any information and advisory service and are kept informed of such matters. To perform such acts and functions in accordance with law to enforce the provisions of the Act. To submit appropriate proposals to the Minister for the making of regulations under the Act, and to advise the Minister on the organizational structure, staff requirements, and operations for the proper and efficient functioning of the agency. So, like TTBS, OSHA also has inspectors. So these are the rights and powers of our inspectors. So they are to enter and inspect every industrial establishment in Trinidad and Tobago. And an industrial establishment is not quite what laypersons may assume. It is defined as a factory, shop, office, place of work, or other premises, excluding residential premises. To request the production of evidence, to require persons to give information, to investigate accidents occurring in an industrial establishment, to exercise powers of the OSH Act include serving improvement notices or a prohibition notice, which will stop all dangerous work in a particular area or the use of a piece of machinery in some instances. To request the presence and assistance of a police officer if necessary. To request to be accompanied by specific persons, to take photographs and samples, and to take declarations from persons. So the OSH Act has been around since 2006, as I stated before, and there have been no amendments such. The regulations have been imported from the Factories Ordinance, and as you can understand, the ordinance having been created in 1948 is quite old, to say the least. But the OSH Act prescribes obligations on the part of employers as well as employees. And a lot of people forget that employees also have a duty under Section 10 of the Act to do certain things and not to do certain things to safeguard themselves as well as their fellow workers. Systems and policies geared towards assessing and minimizing risk of harm are key requirements of the Act. It was determined that certain aspects of the safety and health law required clarification, amplification, and updating. Therefore, in 2017, OSHA held 4 national tripartite stakeholder consultations in Port of Spain, Macoya, San Fernando, and Tobago regarding the identification of areas for amendment under the OSH Act. The purpose of the consultations was to obtain feedback from all stakeholders in order to inform proposed amendments to the OSH Act. All the feedback was collated, carefully reviewed, and draft policy documents were prepared and submitted to the line ministry, that is the Ministry of Labor, for feedback, which was obtained in July 2020. So we're still in the process of putting together final draft documents. The following sectors were identified as key sectors in that process, and those were manufacturing, agriculture, services, construction, energy, and government. And we all know that construction has, over the years, posed quite some area of concern, a more visible concern. So under Section 99(1) of the OSH Act, the minister may make regulations for the purpose of promoting the safety, health, and welfare of employees, and generally for the purpose of carrying out the provisions of this Act. So it is in relation to this that OSHA has been preparing these draft policy documents, which would facilitate the creation of regulations via the line ministry and the Chief Parliamentary Counsel's office. So this is a list of the draft policy documents thus far. Further consultations were also held on revised policy position papers as follows. We have PUA, that was held on August 21st, 2018. LOLA, August 23rd, 2018. The National Occupational Safety and Health Policy on April 29th, 2019 in Trinidad and May 3rd in Tobago. The Safety of Precious Systems Regulations on May 1st, 2019. The Gas Safety, Use, Conveyance, and Storage Regulations on May 13, 2019. The Blasting and Use of Explosives Regulations on May 15th, 2019. And the Occupational Safety and Health Welfare Regulations on May 17, 2019. Revision of the draft policy documents were undertaken, and a second draft was completed during the period of October 21st to 25th, 2019. So the agency is in process, as I established earlier on, of reviewing all documents, all draft documents, and with the view of sending the final drafts to the ministry for onward transmission. Interesting to note as well that OSHA plans to have a second round of consultations on a draft policy on welfare regulations pursuant to recommendations by the Joint Select Committee of Parliament. So now we go on to the Memorandum of Understanding. So one may ask, what is a Memorandum of Understanding? It is a formal agreement of broadly agreed terms outlining mutually accepted expectations of the parties. So the rationale behind this MOU, our Act in section 69.5 states that the agency shall initiate consultation with governmental entities performing various inspection functions with the objective of formulating memoranda of understandings or other arrangements between the agency and such other governmental entities, which shall establish the mechanisms for coordination across jurisdictional lines and provide for the implementation of integrated occupational safety and health programs. In accordance with Section 15 of the Standards Act, the TTBS shall promote and encourage the development and maintenance of standards, and further shall establish standards including, but not limited to, promoting public and industrial welfare, health and safety for the protection of the environment. So we see the connection in terms of the mandates, the statutory mandates between both entities. OSHA and TTBS signed the MOU on September 8, 2020. The MOU between TTBS and OSHA therefore seeks to set out the roles of TTBS and OSHA's inspectors in the investigation and all work related to accidents. It's also geared towards encouraging seamless cooperation between TBS and OSHA to avoid ambiguity as to roles and other aspects, to allow for information sharing, particularly as it relates to approved standards where possible, and this is very important. To promote efficient collaboration in respect of coordination and cooperation on the activities where there is coincidence of jurisdiction in order to achieve clear and coordinated policies and activities in respect of industrial establishments bound to the obligations and duties of the OSH Act and the Standards Act. So you see in Section 4 of our Act, the OSH Act that is, the term approved standard is defined as follows. As the context may admit, means a national or international standard so declared or adopted by Trinidad and Tobago Bureau of Standards under the Standards Act, and includes any appropriate type as determined by the authority. Section 61C, 9B, 23.1, 32 and 33.1 of the OSH Act also stipulate those requirements pertaining to PPE, fugitive emissions, respiratory protection, and lighting to be of such an approved standard. It is clear from the legislation that there are links between TTBS and OSHA in relation to safety and health, so that continued collaboration is key to enforcement with a view to encouraging the implementation of systems, policies, and procedures while adhering to approved standards for the safety and health of our working population and others. And I thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Patel, for that presentation highlighting the important role of standards and especially in ensuring the health and safety of our working population is maintained. So I will now turn over to the next presentation where I will be presenting on the national standards that we have within the health and safety portfolio. So I will just take 1 minute to share my screen. So can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm the manager of the Standardization
Yes,
Division
yes,
at
yeah.
TTBS, and we will be going into basically what are standards and the importance of standards to the national economy. So some of you all may be very, but just key roles and responsibilities of TTBS. TTBS operates under the Standards Act number 18 of 1997, and we have several responsibilities under that act. We're the national standards body. We're also the national quality certifying body, as well as the national laboratory accreditation body. And under the Metrology Act number 18 of 2004, we are also the National Measurement Institute. We operate under several different policies and strategies. We have the National Quality Policy. This deals with the concept of the national quality infrastructure. It is available on our website. So I encourage everyone to take a look at the quality policy. It looks at the importance of standards or certification, inspection, testing, metrology, and accreditation in building the socioeconomic situation in our country and ensuring that we receive quality in products and services for both the quality of life, but in the increased competitiveness of our country. We also have the National Standardization Strategy, and we will be going into that a little later on in the presentation. At TTBS, we have several different responsibilities. I would have highlighted some of them already. At standardization, we deal with different levels of standardization. So we have national, regional, and international standards. We also have different levels of metrology, industry, scientific, legal. We also have inspection activities as they relate to the standards that are compulsory, and compulsory standards are essentially law. And we have an inspection body at TTBS responsible for ensuring compliance with these compulsory standards. We also have certification and several supporting laboratories at TTBS. To go into detail as it relates to the standards mandate of TTBS, we're responsible for developing, promoting, and encouraging standards for the improvement of goods produced in the country. So we have a number of standards that are quality related, but we also have the very critical mandate of promoting public and industrial welfare, health, and safety, as well as the protection of the environment. And today we will look at some of the key health and safety standards that we have presently at TTBS, and we will narrow down into the TTS/ISO 45001, and my colleague, Ms. Andy Prasad Maraj, will be dealing with that. So as I mentioned before, we have several different levels of standardization. At the national level, TTBS is responsible for issuing national standards. At the regional level, you may be familiar with an organization called CROSSQ, or the CARICOM Regional Organization for Standards and Quality. And they essentially develop standards at the regional level within the CARICOM region to facilitate trade across the member states. There's also a regional body called COPANT, or the Pan American Standards Commission, dealing with harmonization and sharing of knowledge related to standards with our Latin American counterparts, as well as North America and the Caribbean. And at the international level, you may be very familiar with ISO, or the International Organization for Standardization, dealing with international standards. There's a sister organization called IEC, or the International Electrotechnical Commission, and the IEC deals specifically with the electrical area, or the electrotechnical area of standardization. So TTBS is responsible for coordinating the national input into the regional and international standardization levels. I would have highlighted, the importance of approved standards as it relates to the legislation for occupational safety and health. And for TTBS, we use a standard definition of a standard. It has to be established by consensus, meaning that we engage a cross-section of stakeholders to approve by national and international standardization. And it is so it will allow for repeated use and consistent, harmonized way. So it can be considered as a consolidation of best practice. And very importantly, standards represent what are the minimum requirements. So they can be characteristics. So it is very common dealing with requirements of a particular product. We can also have codes, for example, our electrical wiring code dealing with the installation requirements. We also have building codes to assist in construction of buildings and structures to ensure safety. And we have a number of standards, meaning that you can assess a particular parameter or assess a characteristic of a product. So standards can cover a variety of things. For example, it can cover the product itself, the systems, and again, 9001 is one of the very familiar ISO standards dealing with what we call management systems that can be used by companies to improve performance. The 45001 standard that we're here today to discuss covers basically the requirements for occupational safety and health systems that can be used by companies to improve compliance to health and safety legislation or to improve health. For the TTBS, we have two types of standards that are specified in the Standards Act. And I will deal with the compulsory standards first. These standards impact directly on health and safety of the user or protection of the environment. They're enforceable by law. Therefore, TTBS has the inspection, which is placed at the ports of entry. They also conduct market surveys that are compulsory due to the approval of our minister responsible for trade and industry. On the other hand, we have voluntary standards that represent minimum levels of acceptability. Standards such as quality management systems, environmental management systems, and occupational health and safety systems would fall into this category, and they can be adopted at the discretion of business. However, there is a third category where TTBS can develop a voluntary standard which is used to support the regulatory framework of another regulatory agency. And one of the very well-known examples of that would be the letters by the Electrical Inspectorate Division under the Ministry of Public Utilities, thereby ensuring that requirements are essentially mandatory. So just a quick synopsis of the standards development process. First, there has to be a need identified, and this is G, and we will discuss that in another slide. We would conduct technical and market research and prepare a working draft. We would assemble a specification committee comprising a variety of stakeholder interests, for example, manufacturers, importers, practitioners, academia, NGOs. So really depending on the specific product or service or system to be standardized, we will assemble a team of experts from industry, both private sector and public sector, as well as NGOs, academia, to help in crafting the requirements to ensure the standard. Based on our Standards Act, we would have to issue the draft standard for public comment, and we would now use a 60-day minimum comment to ensure that all stakeholders who are not represented move on to resolving the comments. And finally, the standard has to be approved by our board of directors. So our board of directors, they would essentially declare all standards as national standards, and then we would move on to the publication stage. In the event the standard is compulsory, we have to do some legal processes in order for a Minister of Trade and Industry to confer the compulsory status to the standard in order to ensure that TTBS can enforce the requirements of the compulsory standard. At TTBS, we have a number of different areas of standards development, ranging from electrical, construction, environment, consumer products. For example, we recently issued some compulsory standards for laundry detergent. We are also revising some of our key standards related to garments and textiles. We have issued a number of standards related to energy efficiency labeling of key electrical products, for example, CFLs and LEDs, as well as working on some new energy labeling standards for air conditioners and refrigerating equipment. We have the traditional areas of standardization, for example, quality, and we recently issued a number of standards related to information communication technology, specifically information security management systems. And this is to aid our digital transformation efforts at the national level. And of course, we have the health and safety portfolio. I would just like to highlight some of the emerging areas of standardization. At the international level, there is a significant focus on sustainability. We are also engaged in developing international standards for governance of organizations, circular economy, and more recently, we will be looking at excellence in service at the request of the Ministry of Public Administration and Digital Transformation. So you'll see that there has been a transition from the traditional product type standard in terms of service and more management systems. I will just go very quickly into our national standardization strategy. It is essentially a 3-year work program. So it lists all the prioritized standards projects that TTBS will be developing at the request of external stakeholders. And it is to support our socioeconomic initiatives. So contribution to GDP is important, improving export potential, for example, due to the COVID-19 and the need to look at agriculture in a significant way. We have issued national standards related to good agricultural practices. So we are striving for alignment to our government initiatives, but also looking at what key industries require to improve performance and also health and safety and serve some social objectives. So again, our NSS is aligned to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and some key objectives of the NSS would be to ensure a robust and responsive NSS, meaning that we can respond to stakeholder requests for standards that support our national objectives, also to create a standards conscious society and encourage stakeholders to utilize standards, and also the use of ICT to modernize the standards development process. And today is a good example of that, where we have to use a lot of digital technologies in order to have our stakeholder engagements. I would like to highlight some of the requests that came in as we were developing the national standardization strategy. The sizing of garments using PPE, so the issue of protective clothing, the issue of occupational health and safety management systems, for the refrigeration industry, looking at the refrigeration code. And we also had requests for waste management, risk management, disaster management, as well as indoor air quality, wastewater reuse, and the transport of hazardous chemicals. So I encourage all the participants to take a look at our national standardization strategy. The document is available on the TTBS's website, and we welcome feedback so that we can prioritize our standards over the next 2 years. So I will look now at the national standards that fall into the health and safety portfolio. So we have the 45,001. We also issued a standard for work at heights. All these standards are now up for review, and we encourage you to provide feedback on the very specific improvements that we can make and whether there are any new standards that are needed to support occupational safety and health. We would have developed a standard for eye and face protection devices, some standards for protective equipment, or specifically focus on footwear, occupational diver training. So I'd like to highlight that we are now recommencing our revision of a national standard on commercial diving operations. So you probably hear some more about that over the next couple of months. Risk assessment. We also had some standards, and Patel would have highlighted in a presentation where the OSH Act specifically speaks to approved standards. We have a standard for place design and looking at the lighting of indoor
message, eh?
places.
Just remember that. I ain't giving no message. Just remember that.
I will just ask all the participants to mute themselves. So just to continue on, there's a standard for contractor safety management systems, a code of practice for the prevention of damage to hearing from noise at work. And with regard to these two standards, we welcome your feedback to help us improve these standards. I would have highlighted commercial diving operations. We would like to recommence that in May. And again, several standards related to safety footwear. I will now go over the ISO Technical Committee 283, and this is a technical committee formed under the International Organization for Standardization. It deals with standardization in the field of occupational health and safety management, and it really focuses on controlling risk and improvement of the health and safety performance. It is one of the committees that we are actively following. Ms. Andya Prasad Maraj, she is our technical secretary for National Mirror Committee. We have established a committee that would follow the development of standards in this area at the international level. And I would like to highlight that we would have established a National Technical Committee for Occupational Safety and Health. This committee would have reviewed the ISO 45001 and confirmed its suitability for adoption at the national level and making national deviations to ensure that it can be utilized at the national level. And at today's session, we'll be hearing from several of the committee members. So I would like to highlight Mr. Edu from Irish Caribbean, Mr. Virgil from COSTAT. We will also be hearing from PLE in our panel discussion later. And we encourage you to inform us if you have an interest in being part of this National Technical Committee, because we are reconvening this committee to take a critical look at the national standards that we need to revise or develop, and also to follow the work of the International Technical Committee, TC 283. So that is the end of my presentation, and we will take all questions later on in the session, and you can use the chat to indicate your questions, and we'll monitor the chat as well. So I'm going to stop the share, and I will now turn you over to Mr. Christian Virgil. So I would mention that he's a key member of our National Technical Committee. And Mr. Virgil is an industrial engineering doctoral student at the University of the West Indies. He's a senior lecturer at COSTAT, and his research interests include the impact of climate change, occupational safety, and public health on various aspects of organizational practices and performance. So thank you, and I'll turn you over to...
Hi, good morning. Thank you so much. Just give me a few seconds to set up my screen. Just a quick check. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes, we're seeing the screen.
Okay. So pleasant good morning to everyone. Thank you so much for having me here. So my presentation, I'm going to be examining how to build an effective OH&S system, or occupational health and safety system. Our presentation would take place in really three phases. First, I'm going to lay the background of health and safety in Trinidad and Tobago. Then I'm going to discuss from an evidence-based perspective how we can go about making our health and safety systems a little bit more effective. And I'm going to end my presentation by examining some characteristics of organizations in Trinidad and Tobago based on a very quick assessment of the organizations and how they're implementing their health and safety systems. So let me dive into some critical statistics. Now, my statistics are not as up to date as I would have liked it to be, but I give a lot of, I extend my gratitude to the Occupational Safety and Health Authority for helping me gather what I have now. So probably in a future date, I'll be able to update some statistics and show you what is really happening more recently. However, during the period 2006 to 2015, 102 persons lost their lives in tragic workplace accidents. That boils down to approximately 10.2 deaths per year. If you look at my graph to the right, you will notice that the trend seems to be very well varied, but you look at 2016 to 2017, and we seem to have had some sort of spike around that time. Now, what was responsible for that spike? If we move on to my other slide, on the far left, you also notice that we have the fatalities between 2016, 2017, 2018, we have them disaggregated by sectors. The blue bars on the left, I'm going to highlight those with my red arrows. Those are the ones that correspond to 2016 to 2017. And you notice that the largest sector, or the sector responsible for the greatest amount of fatalities would be the transport and storage sector. One of the things I always talk about when we're looking at statistics is that I remind my students and colleagues that statistics do not accurately reflect the human aspect of what these things represent. When you look at the papers, anything, you would see 1 or 2 deaths or 1 or 2 injuries, but that sort of dehumanizes actually what is really happening. So I included in this presentation 2 articles from the Guardian newspaper highlighting some of the more visceral aspects of these accidents and these fatalities and these injuries. The one on the far left, titled "All Workers Widow Calls for Full Pro." I actually had the opportunity to speak to her directly a few years back when I was collating some data for my research and also for a mini documentary. And it highlighted how bad it was for her to really deal with the tragic death of her common law husband at the time. So I included these 2 clips from The Guardian just to highlight that there are human aspects attached to these statistics and not just a number of people that are dying or being injured. I also noted that there seems to be a dearth of information regarding occupational diseases in terms of our statistics and how we are gathering information regarding those. And that certainly would be something that would be discussed in later presentations, more likely within the panel discussion. So this was one of the cases I would have discovered, again, personally from my research and my analysis of what's going on. And this was a case whereby Mr. Alves, he would have contracted spongy cell leukemia. It was attached to, or rather linked to, plastics from the company he was working at the time. Some of you also may recall Mr. Daisley would have gotten nasopharyngeal cancer. He recently, well, not recently, a couple of years ago, would have won his case regarding exposure to carcinogens while working at an industry in Trinidad and Tobago. So although the prevalent occupational issues involve physical injuries, there's a growing concern that we need to really look at occupational diseases as well. And this would tie in so nicely with regards to the COVID-19 pandemic and the environment that we are currently adjusting to, the importance of examining diseases as well. Now, all of these injuries and deaths and all these things that are happening, there's also another side to the problem, apart from the obviously heinous injuries and the deaths and the emotional, psychological, and physiological impact of them. We also have the financial aspect of it as well. So I got some data from National Insurance Board, Trinidad and Tobago. Again, I'd like to extend my thanks to them as well. And on your far left, we are looking at the number of claims for compensation. And as you see, it's basically a little bit varied. There's no really distinct pattern to it. There appeared to be a spike in 2013, the amount of people applying for claims. The graph on the far right is the one that a little bit alarming to me. The graph on the far right represents the total payouts that were made during these years. And you'll notice that in 2015, we paid out over more than $17 million to compensate for some of these injuries and so forth. Now, this amount of money that we are quoting or that I'm quoting here, it's not the actual costs of these accidents. As most of us will be aware of, there are many direct and indirect costs. This only represents the payment from NIB. Now, we have a very interesting compensation system in Trinidad and Tobago, which would probably come up in our panel discussion as well. So I can certainly tell you that that figure does not represent the actual costs of these accidents. Okay? But of course, it's readily available data that we can put into this presentation. So there are costs attached to these accidents. So up to this time, we established that we have a good bit of accidents happening in the country. We have deaths occurring. There's a human aspect to it, real suffering, real pain. And we also established that there is an economic cost attached to all these things that are happening in our country. Again, I always remind my students as well that economics is not all about what is not the full picture of it. One of those payouts that I have there in the far left graph would have been one that would have been received by Mr. Paragat, also another person I would have had the opportunity to have a discussion with in my research and analysis. And the figure seems high. 17 million plus is a quite significant amount of money. I actually compared that cost to how many things we could have done. But I included his story in my presentation because yes, it's a lot of money, but that payout he'd have received cannot give him back his leg that he lost at a very young age. All right. So yes, there were compensations and so forth, but that cannot restore Mr. Parag's leg. Okay? The money he received did not make, well, it made his life better, but it could not give him back his leg. Okay? So that's the end of my first arc where I'm laying down the groundwork, or rather the background of health and safety and statistics regarding injuries and accidents occurring in Trinidad and Tobago. So now I'm going to go into my second arc where I'm going to discuss making health and safety management systems effective. Now, I will not dive too much into the structure and nature of health and safety management systems. I'll leave that to subsequent presentations, okay? However, fundamentally, a management system in general is a system that organizes the movement and use of information within organizations. Now, the critical elements of an effective safety management system are management commitment and employee involvement, worksite analysis, hazard prevention and control, training for employees, supervisors, and managers. An effective management system has proven to be a decisive factor in reducing the extent and severity of work-related injuries and illnesses. Basically, a health and safety management system will result in reduced injury-related costs. Okay, so that's a quick oversight as to generally what management systems are, critical elements of a safety management system and the importance of having one in terms of its impact on health and safety. Again, a thorough assessment and discussion of management systems I will leave to subsequent lectures. Okay? So, what are the keys to success? In the research I would have done, or rather my critical examination of the literature on the subject matter, the findings are mixed as to whether any individual element of a safety management system would have a stronger influence on safety over any other element. So I would want to make sure I highlight that point critically. The findings are a little bit mixed as to which ones are the ones you really need to just focus on. So that's a very important point I need to highlight to preface what I'm about to discuss in the subsequent slides. What I also found was that the keys to success also appear to vary a lot based on the industry. However, there was one general principle that seemed to have just stuck out in all of the data I would have reviewed. So according to a study by Thomas, incorporating safety management systems into normal business operations can possibly and has been found to be one of the critical factors in reducing accidents and improving safety in high-risk industries. All right? And incorporating safety into normal business operations, I mean, that's something fundamental that most safety professionals are already aware of, meaning that you cannot have safety on one side and then there is business operations, meaning that with some regards, and some industries in particular that view safety as just as important as profit, those are the ones that tend to really have safer environments. Now, two studies that were conducted in the manufacturing and the chemical industries found that those companies that had a certified safety management system had significantly lower accident rates. So this would be a good time to actually advocate for one of our more popular management systems, of course, the ISO 45001, meaning that studies have found that those who incorporate a certified safety management system are those that tend to have lower accident rates. It also takes me to a fundamental principle as the first step to really developing an effective safety management system. That would be to develop one based on a reputable standard like ISO 45001. All right. So this study actually highlighted that having these certified SMS standards or implementing them has found to be impactful in terms of lowering accident rates. Another study by Ascona and Hadikusumo demonstrated that as it relates to the construction industry, the following factors are most associated with a reduction in accident rate: incident investigation, auditing, subcontractor management, and safety incentives. Now that last one is a very interesting one because there have been many studies about safety incentives and how they may impact on worker safety, okay? And one of the things that I would highlight right at this point in time would be that safety incentives, they have been linked to underreporting actually, not necessarily an improvement in safety, or which we can probably discuss in our panel discussion a little bit later. However, this was one of the critical findings. And again, I started my discussion on this arc by mentioning that the findings suggest that there are different things based on industry that may impact on the safety aspects of that industry. Now, a study by Wieselbacher and Jin found that hazard identification, tracking hazard control efforts or monitoring implementations of your hazard controls, and health promotion programs were the three most critical components in the US manufacturing sector. Right? So this finding suggests that, yes, the construction industry, these were the critical things, but they found that the manufacturing industry in US, these were the things that they found to be the most critical aspects to creating a very effective safety management system. Now, granted, This is a US-based study, all right? And we're going to look at a little bit about Trinidad and Tobago soon. Now, a study from the UK offshore oil and gas industry found that management commitment, health promotion, and surveillance were most associated with a decrease in accident rates. Right? The last point I would just highlight in terms of my findings would be that a Dutch study, they found that simply having constructive dialogue between shop floor line management, providing motivation to management, and strengthening the monitoring and learning loops in the safety management systems appeared to be more successful. This was a general principle that they discovered. It was not applicable to any particular industry. So as I mentioned before, we did a very, very quick and very quick survey just to look and examine what's going on in Trinidad and Tobago. And we got a few responses that helped me to sort of look at what's happening. Now, again, the sample size is too small to infer anything about the entire population, but just give us a very quick idea as to what's happening in our systems in Trinidad and Tobago. So from the survey that was carried out, most of the companies that responded, they had more than 500 employees. That was the bulk of my survey. The industries that they came from, they operated within, were varied from transport and storage to construction, administrative, wholesale, manufacturing, and others. For those of you guys who are eagle-eyed and looking at it, you would notice that those numbers next to that, to my industry, do not add up to, well, I didn't mention before, but I had about 11 responses. So there's another to 11 because some companies operated in a wide variety, in a lot of different industries. Okay? So what did I really discover about these industries? One, all of them implemented an occupational health and safety management system. About 90%, 91% had an OHS manual or developed a manual to go along with the system. And an equivalent amount, equal amount rather, they conducted regular accident investigations. Also discovered was that most of those responding to my quick survey found that the accident rate and the number of lost days were reduced after they implemented their health and safety management system. 70% agreed with that statement that there was a yearly reduction in the accident rate and lost days after the system was implemented. To the 6.4% of my respondents, they agreed that hazard identification actually improved after the management system was implemented, meaning that there were a lot more identification of hazards, which, as we know, it's a proactive safety performance indicator, or one of the proactive indicators of safety performance. Only 9.1% strongly agreed with it. And of course, we had some disagreements that there was an improvement in hazard identification. Now, I tried to examine how it may vary based on the size of the company. Are we seeing something different in the smaller ones versus the bigger ones? For the most part, it seems to be mainly just right across the board. Okay? When it comes to examining workers trained, I asked the question, did you see was there a lot more workers trained after you have implemented the system? Of course, there was a strong agreement, and similar to the previous slide, it was fairly consistent among the sizes of the company, meaning that the larger companies reported almost the exact same thing as the smaller one. What I would note is that it seemed to be a strong sense that there are more training happen in the larger companies than the smaller ones. Okay? We also investigated the challenges that these companies may have had, and the top 4 challenges that they had implementing their systems was that the There are some difficulties getting compliance for employees, staff and trade union support. They also alluded that workplace culture was a problem as well. And then there was a disagreement regarding how the program should be administered. Okay. Now, we're going to look a little bit about the COVID-19 within the workplaces. All of the companies created COVID-19 safety-specific instructions. However, only 81.8% considered mental health as part of the response. And that is actually a very serious problem because, as we all are aware by now, we have a lot of issues with mental health, people working at home, isolation, and soon fatigue. So this will be a nice place for me to end my presentation so that we can now probably enter into some of these discussions in the panel. So a list of references so that you guys can all look at all the articles I would have referenced in my presentation, and just like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Virgil. There are some questions in the chat so that we can probably take a look at after the presentations are completed. So I will now turn you over to Ms. Andrea Prasad Maraj, and she'll be presenting on enabling safe and resilient workplaces with TTS/ISO 45001-2020. Andrea studied engineering at the University of the West Indies before proceeding to work in the fast-paced oil industry as a designer for wellhead equipment. Passionate about quality and standards, her move to the TTBS was a natural fit. With close to a decade of experience in the field of standards, Andy is responsible for the national portfolios for occupational health and safety, as well as energy efficiency in buildings and automotive products. So I'll now turn you over to Andia to start her presentation.
Good morning, everyone. Just give me 1 minute to share my screen. Okay, and just to confirm, we're hearing me and seeing the screen, the presentation on your screen.
Yes, Andrea.
Okay, great. Okay, so good morning, everyone, and happy World
Morning.
Health and Safety Day in the workplace. So as Nadita mentioned, I'm going to be discussing how we can create and enable a safe and resilient workplace and using our national standard, TTS ISO 45001. Now, a great place to start our conversation this morning is with COVID-19. We're all living through a pandemic, and that means we all know the struggles, the fears, the anxieties, and all the adjustments we've had to make, as well as where we have this now move where everyone is going through COVID-19 and everyone is concerned about their health and safety. We're also looking at more interest in health and safety standards. Excuse me 1 second. Are you hearing me clearly, just to confirm?
Yes, yes,
Okay,
Andrea.
great. Sorry about that.
That's
Okay,
okay.
great. Okay, so we're moving towards now where we have more and more persons are interested in health and safety in the workplace. And a great example is that is in office buildings where we were discussing where the major concern for health and safety would have been the proverbial paper cut. And we're now having this more concern for indoor air quality. And a good example is Harvard University just came out with a work paper on it, where the major cause based on their studies for the spread of in-house infections in hospitals had less to do with hygiene practices and more to do with air quality. And where we have this now focus, because there's a huge collective focus on health and safety and more a major concern with it, we also now need to evolve our conversations from just being adjusting to the workplace for COVID-19 and be able to evolve our conversations into how do we create more safer and resilient workplaces. So in my presentation, we're going to have little discussions on how we can create that jumping board into resilient workplaces. We're going to cover 3 major topics, looking at creating an OHS system using the Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle. We'll do a brief overview of TTS ISO 45001. I do want to emphasize that training in ISO 45001 normally takes a couple days. I just have minutes, so it's going to be a very brief introduction to the standard, as well as what we'll do is highlight some of the specific clauses from there. And then into the last part of the presentation, we're going to look at how TTS ISO 45001 and its requirements can be used to solve problems, because standards are more than just requirements on a paper. They're business tools. So we're going to show how those requirements can help solve the issues that industry is facing. Okay. So let's start with the Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle. Now, as it says, it's really first planning and identifying what it is you want to achieve, then implementing it and actually maintaining the initiatives you've set out to do, followed by checking to make sure, are we doing what we planned to set out and how effective it is in solving our initial problem? And then going on to the last step, acting on that and making sure that we are able to make the changes, make it more effective, and achieve what we want to do. And it's important to remember that this isn't a one-off situation, but it's a cycle. Or if I have any maths nerds with me, it's an iterative process, because we want to have that consistent approach to identify what we want to achieve, actually doing it, and then checking to make sure that 1, we're doing it, and 2, is it being an effective approach to what we want to achieve. And a lot of presentations or studies will emphasize the importance of the Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle. But equally important is to understand what happens when we don't have a cycle or we have a breakdown in the system. And that creates a schism between, a schism in knowledge between, are we actually achieving what we set out to do, and are our employees experiencing what we tried to implement, as well as there's no check to see, is it the most effective solution to what we planned to do? And that's why it's always important to create that system and to have that in place to always make sure we're doing what we plan to do and it's working effectively. So with that understanding then, we're now going to look into a brief overview of TTS ISO 45001. So the national standard is a modified adoption of the international standard 45001 in 2018. You'll see our own is dated 2020 because that's the year it was approved and published in Trinidad and Tobago. Now, in doing our modified adoption of this national standard, our committee would have taken great care to ensure that the technical requirements in the national adoption remains quite equivalent to the international standards. So if you're already familiar with ISO 45001 or you're already complying with it, there have been no technical changes. What we sought to do then was really to create add-on or additional information for users specifically in Trinidad and Tobago. So for example, we have given additional information on specific laws that companies would need to comply with. And this information has been directly incorporated into the ISO 45001 standard. So it's one document and it's easy for persons to use, as well as we've included an annex with a listing of all the national deviations and the reasons why those deviations or additional information was introduced to the standard. What you'll also be seeing on your screen is a basic layout of the requirements or the clauses. So we have from context of organization, planning, support to improvement. And if you look at it in terms of the plan, do, check, act cycle, those systems also therefore fall into that cycle. So as you can imagine, planning falls under the planning section. We have support and operation. So for the do part of the cycle. And it's important that the standard looks at not just doing the operations that we set out in planning, but creating that supporting mechanism, having enough human resources, training resources, and funding resources to actually carry out your OHS management system. And of course, for check, we have performance evaluation and 10 improvement. But what's very unique and central to TTS ISO 45001 and ISO 45001 is clause 5, which focuses on leadership and worker participation. And this clause is really considered to be the core of the standard or the success area. Some even call it the fulcrum of the standard. And it's where we actually hoped and designed it to create the change in that for OHS management system, you need leadership commitment in it, and there are requirements for that, as well as to involve workers in the process. So it becomes a business or a joint effort between management and workers to create a health and safe environment and culture within the organization. Okay, now just pulling out some of the clauses to highlight. Context of the organization. This is where there are requirements for the organization to highlight its or investigate its internal and external issues. And this is where we say it's specific to the organization. You're going to investigate your risk and opportunities that are specific to your operations. And in being a risk-based approach document, it means this standard can be used by any organization of any size or type. So your oil field refineries and your hairdresser stations, they can all use this standard because it's going to be designed specific to their mode of operations and the risk and opportunities specific to them. Also, within the context of the organization, you're going to look at things such as defining your OHS management system and which parts of your operations fall under the system. I do want to highlight that because it's, if you might have an organization might have a particularly dangerous operation, they're like, okay, we will not put that under the OHS management system. The standard doesn't allow for that. So because our operation is has a high level of unsafety, it doesn't give you a reason to exclude it from your scope for your OHS management system. You still need to consider it. And then you'll see a phrase which is consistent throughout the standard and reflects the plan, do, check, act cycle of establish, implement, maintain, and continually improve the OHS management system or any other process developed under this system. And chaining our conversation now, especially on the context of the organization and looking at developing resilient systems, I'm going to highlight some internal and external issues or risk factors that aren't normally considered when developing an OHS management system, but really should be. And a good example is employee trauma. And I've always found this is my best example for explaining employee trauma. When I was in high school, one of our teachers, her house burnt down, was completely gone in fire. And a couple of months later, we had a fire at school, and our classroom was in such a place that we were able to see all the smoke coming and billowing out of the chemistry lab. And our teacher saw it, grabbed her things, and ran. And everyone just was like, there's a fire, and our teacher ran out and abandoned us. But we knew the drills. We had done the fire drills. We knew the operations, closed the windows. Everyone left the room in an orderly fashion. And we were in Form 4 at the time, and were able to respond responsibly to the disaster that we were facing. But let's ask a question now. If that had happened and we were preschoolers, can you imagine some of the risk that might have happened if a teacher had just run out of the room like that? And that's why we need to start to focus on our psychosocial hazards and identification in our OHS management systems. Another place to look at is incorporating crises. So persons might say, okay, COVID-19 came out of nowhere. We were unprepared for it and we've been responding. But not really. The World Economic Forum has had a worldwide pandemic on as one of its major risks for the past 10 years. It's just no one thought one would actually happen. So not much focus has been really on preparing for a pandemic. And now let's translate that into local context. I've been hearing since I was in primary school that Trinidad and Tobago is scheduled or due for a major earthquake. But are we really focusing on preparing or at least letting persons know what we need to do? Do our employees know what is the company's policy on earthquake safety? Do we support the triangle of life or standing in doorways? And that's why we need to be focused on water crises, yes, natural disasters, but economic crises and things that we know are up on the horizon, and being able to proactively prepare our employees and family members for being able to deal with these issues. In regards to sustainability, and this is a buzzword that's going to keep coming up as we progress and look at things such as climate change. And there are particular OHS issues, especially with green buildings in terms of flammability. As we introduce more and more different types of materials into buildings, there are flammability concerns with it. For example, move to natural fibers or to lighter steel and aluminum structures. That translates into less material, which means less structural integrity or less structural fire resistance integrity in a fire. So it's a consideration that we need to have, and a marriage between OHS safety systems and facilities management. As we create a more sustainable building, we also need to be aware of the particular OHS issues that are going to occur with using different materials or different design. And not just to focus on the buildings themselves, but also the sustainability of the workforce. And this is where you're going to have an international move to look at employee wellness. So we're focusing on both the physical health and the mental health of employees to make sure that they can continue to participate and perform well. Just a reminder for participants to mute their mics. Great.
Yeah, you wanna have the whole presentation going on now. Since fucking 10 o'clock, I listen to them like.
Okay, thank you. So looking at leadership and worker participation, as we mentioned, this is the core, or what we consider the core of the standard, and there's specific requirements for top management. We've asked top management shall demonstrate leadership and commitment through taking overall responsibility and accountability for the prevention of work-related injury and health. So it's not, well, we have a health and safety officer, they're responsible for health. No, it's actually the leadership team taking overall responsibility and recognizing that health and safety needs to be incorporated into strategic planning and promoting a OHS culture. And it goes on to further to say, incorporating these health and safety considerations in policy. And as I mentioned before, we would have had some national deviations. So I've just highlighted one here. in Trinidad and Tobago, there are some legal requirements for OHS policies for companies of a certain size. So we've made that reference in the standard so it can trigger as a starting point for persons so that they know that, yes, for their company size, there might be some considerations, legal considerations for the OHS policy. And equally important is consultation and participation of workers. As Christian would have mentioned in his presentation, one of the key success areas for OHS systems are continuing dialogue between management and workers. And the standard looks at making sure that a particular environment is there to create that dialogue and communication. And it allows that management must empower these effective consultation and participation by providing time and training resources so employees are better able to provide input into the OHS management design, as well as emphasizing the consultation of non-managerial workers. The management and consultation and participation workers is really important because it's going to bridge the divide between management's intent and the experience that employees are undergoing. So, for example, if management has put in place sinks at the entry of buildings so workers can wash their hands before they enter, and they might think, okay, we've put in some COVID-19 safety measures here, but then the employees, when they come, they're not, it never has soap. You have a sort of distinction between what the employees, sorry, is there another issue with the audio again? Hello?
No, I'm hearing fine.
No, we're hearing you.
No, yeah, we're hearing fine, thanks.
Oh, okay, because I'm sorry, someone came to the door, so I thought that was the issue again. All right, so once I
Andy,
have,
I'm hearing you good.
okay,
Clear.
great. Okay, so once we're going strong then. So it's important, the consultation of workers, as I was saying, it's important to bridge the gap between management's intent and what is actually being experienced by workers. Okay, and as we mentioned in the check, there's also the performance evaluation. So you're going to be checking for the effectiveness of your OHS system. So it's pretty standard checking that you're actually complying with what you set out to do, as well as how well and effective it works. Okay, so I'm just mindful about the time, so I'll move quickly now into this third part of the program, where we're looking at strategies for using TTS ISO 45001 to address some business concerns or industry problems. And the question that everyone's going to be asking on their minds is, can I use TTS ISO 45001 for safe working during the pandemic? Now, it's an OHS management system and it is risk-based. So by and large, yes, it is a great tool to use, but there are other documents that you should be aware of, and we want to highlight them here. First and foremost, especially in Trinidad and Tobago, we must be aware of the public health regulations. And these are law that which companies must comply with because they are legal requirements. In terms of national guidelines, several ministries, including the Ministry of Health, OSHA, and the Ministry of Labor, have issued guidelines on COVID-19, and we've got some there up for you to look at. On a standards perspective, there is ISO PAS 45005, Safe Working During COVID-19. This international standard is applicable to organizations of all sizes and sectors, including those operating through the pandemic, or just resuming or plan to resume, or are reoccupying workspaces that have been fully or partially closed, or are completely brand new and are starting to work in a pandemic. The standard itself, you can use it as a reference document, but it's ideally designed to serve as an add-on to ISO 45001 because it follows the same plan, do, check, act cycle. And it's really requirements that are adding on to some of the requirements already existing in ISO 45001. As it is a management system, what's particularly unique about this standard, it looks at health and safety, but also business operations as well. So for example, the 45001 would have requirements for planning, as ISO PAS 45005 is a sort of COVID-19 add-on. It will include requirements for planning, but requirements for planning such as giving guidelines for businesses to plan for changes in restrictions or to plan for accessibility and inclusivity of workers. It's one of the few documents that I've come across that includes guidelines for persons with disabilities and designing the workplace for them. And I really want to give kudos to our National Technical Committee members for identifying that, because the initial draft for this standard didn't have any requirements for persons with disabilities. And when our national committee was going through it, it was raised that persons with disabilities or persons who are blind who normally require touch to be able to move about and are now suddenly in a contactless environment, there needs to be some health and safety considerations for them. And that was one of the comments we made on the draft standard, as well as other members of ISO, and it was considered and put forward in the final version of the document. I should mention it was lobbied, and ISO has recognized that this standard is quite important to businesses, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, and it is available for free for view only on ISO's website, and we will share the link in the chat in a few minutes. For a printed version, there's a small cost attached to it. In terms of national standards, we have worked on a publicly available specification for non-medical face masks. And that's something, a form of PPE now that we're all starting to wear, the cloth mask. And this standard is applicable to non-medical face masks made out of paper, plastic, fabric, or any other materials that are disposable or reusable. And it's a great tool if you want to purchase masks in bulk. You can ask the manufacturer to ensure that they're complying with this national standard, or you can identify to your fellow employees guidelines from the standard and what to do when purchasing a mask. So for example, one of the requirements of the standard is that masks shall not have perforations in front of the nose and the mouth. And that generally means like the mask with the seam down the center. The holes created by the stitching in the seam normally line up with your nose and mouth. And that creates a bit of a health and safety issue there. When we're wearing masks to prevent particles from entering, and there are holes lining up directly with our mouth and nose. As well as if you're following us on social media, you might have seen some bulletins that we issue on masks and hand sanitizers. You can check it out to see some general guidelines on what to look for. Okay, so let's talk about another issue that is normally coming up with enabling trust. And we always say trust is like a relationship. It's a relationship between employees, it's a relationship between management employees. And there are certain pillars to creating trust, one being honesty, accountability, and communication. And we can merge and just pull out some of the requirements of TTS ISO 45001, which can create or enable that trusting environment within the workplace. First champion being the plan, do, check, act cycle, using a systematic approach for your health and safety measures. So employees and management can see we've identified and we're actually strategically going after what we've identified to accomplish. And it's a cycle that keeps on going to improve our health and safety system. From accountability, we talked about the leadership requirements of the standard and being able to integrate the OHS management into strategic action plans. There's also requirements regarding internal and external communications on the OHS system. And I do want to highlight that the standard does explain that for them, communication is a two-way mechanism. So it's not just one's communication from one side and just issuing bulletins. That's not considered communication. That's more of information overload. But there must be a system to issue information and receive feedback and adjust in kind. Okay. And one of the last things we're going to look at is mental health. It is a buzzword and it's gotten a lot of focus now in the community. From a standards perspective, we're currently working on a standard for psychological health risk at ISO. And similarly, this is going to be an add-on to 45001. So it's just giving you additional requirements to consider how you're going to incorporate mental health awareness within your OHS system. And I've pulled out some ways we can do it using the existing clause of 45001. Under your context of organization, you need to get to know your employees, the demographics and characteristics of workers. Do you have an aging workforce, and how might mental health affect that? Another key point into looking at your psychosocial hazards and incidents might be industrial relations. And then you just don't want to keep talking about it in theory. You want to actually put forward some strategies for incorporating mental health. And a great way is using policy on psychosocial health and incorporating that, especially under leadership and workership, in strategic plans and your OHS systems. Under planning, you'll want to look at the specific needs of your workplaces and divisions and units, and being able to mitigate any risk that comes up there through implementing rehabilitation programs, giving consideration for flexible hours, job sharing, and things like that. I'll always remember a couple of years ago, we were working on a project with some emergency responders, and they were giving a story, about all the gruesome accidents that they would see as part of their job. And I remember asking about how do you cope with it, being exposed to all of these things. It's not on a TV, you're actually there seeing it. And I remember they said, well, at the end of the day, sometimes the only thing that could really help you is a bottle of Johnny. And we need to be able, as a workplace and as health and safety professionals, recognize the risks that our employees are exposed to and create programs to help them deal and rehabilitate from the exposures to psychosocial risk as part of their jobs. And it's not just emergency workers or police officers, but we want to talk about persons who, as part of their job, are isolated or are normally have to deal with unruly customers, because that can create trauma and then create clinks in your OHS system. And as always, we look at identifying opportunities for improvement. Okay, so I think that brings me to the end of my presentation. What we've done, we've gone through the Plan, Do, Check, Act system, given a brief overview of the TTS ISO 45001, and spoken about how the requirements of the standard can be used to address some of the problems faced by the industry. If you need any more information on TTBS or activities, you can check us out on our website. Or if you'd like more information on health and safety standards, you can give me an email, and my email address is there on the screen. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Andia.
Andia.
In the interest of time, we are going into the panel discussion segment. So I hope the audio is better now. So I would just like to highlight the members of the panel, Mr. Shazam Idu. He is a safety, risk, and resilience professional with 15 years experience in the areas of quality, environment, health, safety, security, and business continuity. And he has worked in several capacities as a full-time employee and freelance consultant in downstream energy, manufacturing, heavy construction, and port and maritime sector. So Mr. Idu is also the chair of our National Technical Committee, so we'd like to thank him for that. We also have Premchand Nandlal, and he's the representative from PLE at today's session. Prem has a successful track record as a HSEQ management professional with over 16 years experience in both the upstream and downstream energy and manufacturing sectors. He has a passion for working with people, personal health and safety and environmental protection, as well as driving continual improvement through leveraging industry trends and technology. We also have Dr. Mark Allen from the Ministry of Health, and he's a public health practitioner for the last 31 years, and he has extensive experience engaging top management within various organizations on their safety management system approaches and impacts. And he's the head of the Occupational Health Unit at the Ministry of Health for the last 3 years. He's also leading the National Occupational Health Policy Development and Research. We also have Ms. Nicole Carr representing the Occupational Safety and Health Agency, and she has over 10 years experience in health and safety. So I'd like to start off the panel discussions and thank the panelists as well as the participants for their participation. But if there are any questions in the chat for panelists, please type them up now. So to start off the panel discussion, we have some questions that we'd like to pose. And given that we're in this COVID-19 pandemic, what do you all see as some of the opportunities for improving the health and safety systems due to the pandemic? And I invite the panelists to turn on their cameras so that we can have a look at them, but also to look very critically at the issues being posed. I know that we had some questions in the chat, so I will be monitoring the chat as well. But generally from today's session, any improvements that we could make to our overall health and safety systems, especially in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Morning all. I think I would like to try my start here as well. Shazam, really in the midst of pandemic, I think we have all realized that most of us focus heavily on safety in our workplaces, on physical safety. And now, at a time now, it's more important to focus on the health aspects of our workplace more than ever now. So those are areas that should be able to focus on now in terms of opportunities for obviously improving. And also at the same time improving in terms of we are working from home a lot. So again, technology is a key thing in that as well.
Thank you, Shazam. I think clearly the use of digital technologies and the issue of working at home is something that we really have to take into account under the psychosocial aspects of our health and safety systems as employers. As practitioners, we also need to embrace what is also considered best practice. And I believe Andia highlighted some key examples from the international fraternity that could benefit the overall health and safety systems within the country. So I would like to move on to any questions that we have from the participants. I see Tremaine Rogers has a question, so I will answer that. She asks, what are the requirements for joining the National Technical Committee? I would have indicated that we are revamping this committee and we want to ensure that there's greater participation. So an email to Andia or myself would suffice, expressing interest. So I would put out that call to all the participants who have an interest. So under the stewardship of Shazam, we would be looking at a number of different standards within the health and safety portfolio. So to bring in any of the other panelists, we spoke a bit about employee wellness, and how do you think that we can incorporate mental health into our plans for occupational health and safety? And perhaps Dr. Allen would like to look at this because he is in the Ministry of Health and also the leader of occupational health.
Hi. Mental health. Mental health has been a big issue worldwide even before COVID-19.
And when we reflect on health, we think about this complete state of social, mental, and physical well-being, and not merely the absence of injury or illness. It might surprise some to know that when you look at the ILO data, worldwide data of occupational accidents and injuries, which cause fatalities, we have over 2.78 million people die each year, 2.78 million deaths each year due to workplace exposures. And it might surprise some to know also that 86% of these fatalities due to work are really because of illnesses and not accidents, right? Much, much more. But the thing about it is there's very low reporting of occupational diseases and work-related illnesses in our place and space, and internationally, actually. Even the data come out from the PAHO, Pan American Health Organization, says that only 1 to 3%, more recently, 3 to 5% of the diseases due to work are diagnosed and reported as such. So we have an underreporting problem, right? And there are many reasons for it. What makes it worse is that now we have different models of work, contract labor, automation, new technologies, changing work demands. And of course, we are cognizant of that with COVID-19, that the work demands and risks have increased significantly within many sectors, not solely the health sector and the protective services. So the result is stress and emotional problems, and anxiety and depression, and even suicide, right? 1 in 5 healthcare workers, the data from the ILO suggests that 1 in 5 have reported depression and anxiety. So what do we need to do? We really need to enable a greater employee locus of control as a preventive measure. We really need to ensure that we have wellness programs in place. We need to make use of the specialists in occupational health and occupational medicine that are available. Traditionally in health and safety, you have a very small H and a much bigger S. So the health part has not been as much emphasized as it should have been. And of course, we need to make sure that there are resources for psychological support available. Example, employee assistance programs, EAPs, right? So you need to ensure that we provide services where there are none, or that we bolster existing services that now exist. So for example, all of the RHAs, all of the regional health authorities have had services and they've even bolstered their services. We need to be familiar with the numbers to call for the national services. The Ministry of Health, for example, developed a workplace mental health policy that addresses anxiety and depression and suicide and stress. And as I think Andy would have mentioned, we have the psychological health and safety at work guidelines being promulgated. The thing about it though, in Trinidad and Tobago, we seem to have a cultural dynamic where Trinis, particularly men, yes, men, feel that it's too macho to access services. Yeah, we could handle that, we could deal with it with detrimental effects. We need also to ensure that we manage COVID stigmatization. Yes, that exists. You know, we are aware of HIV stigmatization that we've been working to really diminish, and we have done so to a tremendous extent. But similarly, we are seeing COVID stigmatization. Oh, you had COVID, right? Even though the person would have fully recovered. So you need to really manage that and to manage workplace harassment and bullying and so on. And just to close I don't want to go on for too much longer, we also need to look at social protections, because sometimes particularly contract workers or other workers who, if they don't work, they don't get paid. And if they don't get paid, they have a problem in terms of sustaining themselves and sustaining their families. So there's a negative knock-on set of effects. So you really need to look at the social protection mechanisms for loss of income, loss of productivity. And it's really a bioethics thing where we need to do what we can do. And there are multiple layers for deep inquiry and deep attention to address all of the mental health and the social knock-on impacts of COVID-19.
If I could just add a quick point. to actually support what Dr. Allen had just said, mental health has been one of those issues we have not been taking a little bit seriously in Trinidad and Tobago for many reasons. One, of course, from a health and safety perspective, is that it's very difficult to measure objectively. I don't even think it probably could be measured objectively. I'm not a psychologist or psychiatrist, but compared to other hazards in the workplace, we can measure them. If you want to examine the amount of carbon dioxide, for example, someone is exposed to, I can measure that with an instrument. You know, objectively assessing the hazard of stress or the psychosocial hazards is a little bit more difficult to do, and actually it's something that's been a little bit neglected by researchers. How do we evaluate the environment for the existence of psychosocial hazards? It's more of a subjective thing than an objective. And the second thing about why I think we don't take it as seriously is because, as Dr. Allen said as well, I support that there's a bit of a stigma attached to it, whereby once you say you have any sort of mental issues, the Trinidadian culture, crazy or you're weak, either or. There's no spectrum. That's a spectrum, you know. So there's no normalization of the fact that you could just be having a hard time. I think those are the contributing factors that lead to it and lead to that not taking mental health seriously. So if I were to suggest how do we really incorporate it successfully, we need to start to establish mental safety identification as part of our system. I don't have any idea how to do that objectively, but certainly we could do it subjectively, just as much as we evaluate the environment for the existence of other hazards on a regular basis. We can conduct surveys on mental health. Most of us who are here working at home, or some of you are working at home, I'm not sure if you have ever been given a survey as to how you are going home. Are you okay? Are you under stress? Is Zoom stressing you out? Has there ever been an evaluation of the effects of things, and you to at least find out how the employees are coping under these circumstances? Now, again, this is not really a traditional thing that is really done in the workplace environment. We focus mainly on the other types of hazards. So my point is that there is a need to really start to evaluate it, just as we do other aspects of hazards in the environment, and then make it into something very important as well. And of course, the second point to that is we gradually need to destigmatize the issues with mental health right across the board. Just because you're having a hard time doesn't mean that something is wrong or you can't function, and there's a lot of issues there with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Virgil, and thank you, Dr. Allen, for raising those key points. Christian, I think I really liked your presentation because you presented some of the data, and Dr. Allen mentioned that we have a culture of under-reporting. But I would just like to open up the floor to the participants who would like to ask any questions. And we have one from Tremaine, and she spoke about in observing where establishments have implemented the temperature scanner and sanitizing stations as you enter their business places. Have these stations been approved by this new MOU? And in the event of an evacuation, some seem to be an obstruction and thus pose a hazard. So would any members of the panel like to comment, or perhaps Ms. Carr could comment, from the OSH agency's perspective?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, lovely. I'm looking at the question. I would respond with respect to the evacuation. Now, all establishments should have emergency plan and evacuation routes, in addition to the ones that they may have on entry, or the entry points being used as a point of evacuation. So when it comes to evacuation, if there is a situation where there seems to be an increased obstruction, those things would need to be risk assessed and managed or removed if that is the case. Yeah, the sanitization stations as you enter the workplaces now, that seems to be part of what would fall into the Ministry of Health's guidelines. Is it that Trumina, if she could give us some more information, is it that the block, how, in what way are they, those type of stations inhibiting the evacuation or the ability of persons to leave the establishments? Should be able to give us any feedback in that regard.
I mean, you can go ahead and, turn on your microphone and give some further details. And I also invite any other participants with questions to do the same.
Hi, morning. Are you hearing me?
I'm hearing you, yes.
All right, great. So in observation, as I mentioned, like certain establishments, when it is you go into the establishment, before it would have had a person at the door giving you the sanitization and taking your temperature. So we are now going from that, and they actually have like a stand where you take your temperature and you sanitize via the automatic sensor.
Mm-hmm. I see those outside, yeah.
Yes. So sometimes looking at the space in between the door and where the sanitization station is, it's like probably like 3 feet. So I'm thinking in the event where persons are in a rush to get out, I mean, yes, we tend to do the 6 feet spacing and whatnot. Not everybody adheres to that. We know that, Trinidadians. So in the event of an evacuation and persons, not saying persons of the public, not necessarily the staff members, because they would have their exit routes behind, right? I'm talking about persons from the public. If they need to evacuate, is that a safe distance? As you said, well, maybe Ministry of Health, they would have posed, well, this is a safe distance to have these stations available.
Maybe I can support a bit in this question. I think when you actually lay out your temperature scanners or your sanitization stations, even in putting those items out, you would need to consider maybe a risk assessment in conjunction with the emergency response plan and other documented management systems that you have within your organization. So one would want to make sure that you assess it in such a way that you minimize the risk to the operations per se. So I think it's something that you could look at from a risk point of view in terms of risk assessing, and maybe from your safety team or within your organization, considering the standards, and of course considering your emergency response protocols, traffic peaks, number of persons working within the buildings. Those are elements that you may want to consider in that entire process.
Yeah.
So it should ideally come from a risk assessment.
So once we have a change, just to endorse what you said, Mr. Premchand, once we have a change in a workplace, ideally an establishment needs to ensure that they do a risk assessment. So it falls into like a management MOC process. Any changes in the workplace, so the posting of sanitizers, their location, even the management of the persons who are going into the establishment, ensuring they actually use it. All those things would need to be taken into consideration and incorporated into an emergency response plan and just a COVID-19 response plan in itself. Where I believe in any instance where you think you see something that can cause a risk to persons entering or leaving an establishment, you can, just on personal responsibility, bring it to the attention of management. Of course, there are always channels to let the agency know and have inspectors follow up to ensure that those hazards are removed and managed adequately, right? So all those things are dynamic and really and truly should be put in locations where they minimize risk. I'm not sure of the exact, I guess you can always message me. You could even contact my details to let me know some of the places maybe where you're seeing that as an issue. But that's more or less how those things should be managed. It would be case by case. And of course, I know that there are many businesses that have multiple means of income. Okay, yeah.
Well, thank you for the
Yeah.
response.
You're
Just-
welcome. I hope it was helpful.
Could I just add a bit, Madam Moderator? It's an interesting question that was posed, and it reminds me of the need for, apart from employers doing what is reasonable and practical to be done, sometimes in their enthusiasm to so do, they might create a hazard, as we're discussing now, right, in terms of the placement. And so there's need for an involved workplace employee management approach to ensure that these situations do not exist. But in addition to that, there's also need for strong auditing by the regulatory bodies so that we go out there and we see what is happening as is the case, this instance that we're talking about. And I just want to refer to some data here. For example, the US OSHA, they have a coronavirus-related inspections program. So they issued a number of citations, and in 6 months, 13th of July 2020 to the 14th of January 2021, they issued 275 citations, amounting to over $4 million in citations. When you do the math, you recognize that it's around 14,000 plus US fines per establishment, right? So breaches of the respiratory protection standard and some other breaches all related to COVID. So the Public Health Inspectorate at the Ministry has been diligent in its COVID-19 inspections program, right? And maybe there's a similar specific facilitation or enforcement action on the OSH agency's part, right? I know that there's an industrial, occupational health industrial hygiene unit at the OSH agency. So some of that which the participant mentioned would be some of the things that we'll see through an inspections program by the various regulatory agencies to help those who are helping themselves. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Allen. So we are beyond 12 noon, so we will probably go on for a few more minutes. If there are any questions, I encourage the participants to raise the questions. They can do it via the chat or just simply turn on their mic. But while we wait, I'd like to invite the panelists to give any closing remarks. Are there any questions from the participants?
Thanks,
Yeah, go ahead.
I'd like to make a closing point on that mental health and wellness aspect of things, right? I think we touched on the various elements that really could, from a proactive standpoint and a reactive standpoint, really address this issue of mental health. And I think we need to pay, and I think Shazam mentioned it earlier on, where he said this pandemic has really caused us as organizations, as sectors, to really look into that aspect of health and properly assessing the risks associated with your workplace in terms of health is a major requirement. And I think a lot of organizations need to pay a special focus here. I mean, some of the organizations have been, of course, putting in place risk assessments in relation to workplace health issues, of course, that can impact on health and then, of course, impact on wellness. And some of these things could be in relation to fatigue, welfare facilities, you know the list, right? Ergonomics and all of the above. But beyond that, and I think is the stigma attached to, from a reactive standpoint, that arm of HR that speaks to, employee assistance programs, education, sensitization, making sure that people are comfortable if in fact they do exhibit any sort of symptoms relating to mental issues. How can they, access free of any sort of stigma attached to it? And I think one of the other elements in that is really a self-check mechanism. Sometimes we go about our daily lives and we don't take the time to stop and do a check. And I think that is an area that we can improve on, look at it from that point of view. Even when we communicate through an organization or a sector, Be wary of this, take care of your mental health, adequate campaigns are going out. A simple self-check mechanism from an employee standpoint, even a contract employee, can help in that entire process, making sure the information is there and you break that stigma of the topic of mental health. I'd like to touch on one more element, which is the first question that you asked. And I think Shazam also spoke about, as a result of the pandemic, a lot of focus was placed on health, right? I believe organizations have placed some focus on health over the years. And I think more so than ever, is a big shining light over this whole issue of health as a result of the pandemic. I think some organizations, even within the energy sector, have done virtual 5Ks and virtual exercises and Zumba and yoga and all these things, and it worked pretty well. And it's probably something to consider post the pandemic. But I think one of the major issues that really stood out apart and aside from that focus point on health is that topic of human behavior. And yes, we have some controls in place that allows human behavior to move in a particular way, but human behavior from the standpoint of within the organization and external to the organization. As we all know, in this pandemic, whatever we do outside of the organization can have an impact within the organization. So I think it's very important as an area to look at, notwithstanding the health aspect of things, that area of human behavior, and how can we analyze it in a much more deeper way and get the learnings coming out of that to impact not just the persons or employees within the workspace, but how do we get that impact outside of the workspace as well? That's a key area to look at.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi,
Go ahead, Nicole.
When we spoke earlier, we in one of the presentations that I think it was Andia who did it, she mentioned leadership and worker participation, right? The focus on leadership. I think it's important with respect to mental health and looking at the facilities that businesses have in place for communication between management or top or upper levels, if you want to say, and employees, your ground workforce, your business to actually push and get the day-to-day business of the operations done is very important for some sort of inclusion. With respect to mental health, of means of communication of the issues that business may be facing, so that where possible, the management can actually put some things in place. If it's just like Mr. Things like virtual 5Ks, I mean that the Zoom yoga, those type of activities really do. And we as well team they do get to be better able to than any. So that's what to add with respect to the mental health and ensuring that with that particular element of the standard is leadership and employee participation, that we take that into consideration and how it would greatly improve the culture of the organization, so that in the future we can actually look at a health and safety management system where persons are now part of an improved culture where they're able to speak up and identify hazards and maybe volunteer solutions to problems that they may see in the workplace. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Nicole, for giving that response. I would like to turn over a question to Ms. Erica Crute, who's the manager for Metrology Division at TTBS, and metrology essentially dealing with measurement issues. So the question is about the temperature check tools. Would these tools being used need to be checked occasionally for accuracy? So I'll turn it over to Ms. Erica Crute, please. She's our measurement expert here.
Okay, thanks, Nadita. Yes, any type of measuring instrument requires to be calibrated to ensure that the results that is being given by the instrument is accurate and reliable. That goes across instruments as a whole, and so the temperature devices that are being used in this period of COVID-19, and we're seeing them all over the place in various organizations. Those devices would require to be calibrated. Sorry, did you all hear me? I didn't realize I was muted for a moment there. Nadita, did you hear anything that I said?
Erica, could you repeat just when you were saying the devices would definitely need to be checked for accuracy? Could you go over that section, please? Thanks.
Sure, thanks. Yes, I was saying, just to recap, measuring devices on a whole requires to be calibrated to ensure that the results that are being issued are in fact accurate and reliable. So that includes the temperature measuring devices that are used in various organizations at this time. Those would need to be checked or calibrated to ensure that the results are accurate. The notion that people would normally have is that I purchase a particular instrument, and that means that this instrument, it's new and it would give reliable results, but that is not the case at all. Even though a device is new, it needs to be calibrated to ensure that the results are reliable. As the Metrology Institute, we have various equipment that we use on a daily basis. And those equipment, whether new, it has to be calibrated, and certainly during its lifetime, it needs to be calibrated to ensure that the results that are provided are consistent and reliable.
I'd like to maybe add two lines to that and maybe a closing remark. I think, yes, she's made a very good point there, because I think even where I work right now, we have asked for our temperature monitoring devices to be calibrated, even after within a certain time period of 3 months, 6 months, even 1 year. It's been 1 year already since COVID is here, since last year, March. I think most people may have been using the same device over and just replacing batteries if they have a battery device or charging as needed. But you can get false readings if you see. You should pick up on trends if you're taking notes while taking measurements. And in addition to that, there's 2 areas quickly I want to touch on, is the response plans of organizations when it comes to responding to a case, a COVID case in the organization, and having a plan ready, tested, and obviously operating well and fit for purpose. Most people have, yes, they have the preventive measures, the wash stations, the temperature checks, but we have nothing in place for responding to a case. And if we are to have such a plan, it should be in alignment with your contractors, your service providers, and so forth. So you're all on the same page in terms of response if something were to happen, right? And in addition to that, behind the responding part of it now, if your employees were to maybe 1 or 2 and maybe come in the office and they have an illness and so on, it spreads. Are we doing the investigations afterwards to determine where our barriers failed? And what can we improve? Because we may have all the checks and balances from the gate to the entering the building, but somewhere along the line, something fell down for it to become spread within the organization. So are we doing the investigative part of it at the back end and learning from other organizations where the lessons are learned in terms of mass spreading or major spreading in maybe one locality or one company? So just be cognizant of that and maybe take some time to really look at that part of the operation in terms of investigating and learning from others and lessons learned. Yeah.
Thank you, Shazam, and thank you, Erica, for giving that explanation of the calibration issues associated with the thermometers and the temperature checking tools. So I'd like to bring the session to a close, but I will give one last call to the participants to raise any questions and invite the panelists to give their closing remarks. So Shazam, we can probably start with you.
Well, I think the session today was pretty good. Lots of information. I mean, Virgil did a terrific job, and Dia as well, and the rest of presenters today. I think it was very informative, to the point, and I think we have all maybe learned one thing today to go back to our offices and workplaces to implement something new or make some changes if we haven't already done so already. Yeah.
Thank you, Shazam. I see Tremaine has raised her hand. Please go ahead, Tremaine.
Hi, you hearing me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. So I just wanted to give like a general comment in terms of the knowledge and the information that was brought about today. I'm very grateful and thankful for it. I mean, as a person who, well, my background is really in petroleum engineering, but I did have the opportunity to work at OSHA for a short period of time. So health and safety is one of my major concerns. So as you said, as you would have as you would have observed, I would have mentioned the going into the establishments and seeing the sanitization stations and whatnot. So I'm always on the lookout for things that not really supposed to be in that particular place, right? So health and safety is one of my very big interests, I should say. So I am very grateful for this opportunity to thank you for opening it up to the general public, I should say, so that persons who have that interest would be able to capture this information. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Tremaine. So we appreciate your feedback. I would just like to invite Mr. Virgil, Dr. Allen, Prem, and Nicole to give any closing remarks.
Hi. I'd just like to reiterate that we need to ensure that we do risk assessments for the different circumstances that we are facing on a day-to-day basis within this new normal. So we have the pandemic, which, as Mr. Edu would have said, we've been dealing with the measures for more than a year now. We need to take into consideration all the things that it has caused us to do, caused us to change, and look at the fact that just like the standard would have said, plan, do, check, act, we review. We look at what's working. Mr. Edu also mentioned lessons learned, so that there is a need for businesses to test their system against whatever internal auditing tool they may have to see whether or not the document that they may have written a year ago is still applicable, it is still valid, and it is still effective. So that's really what I want to say in closing. We're looking at resilience and ensuring that we as a community, as persons working, persons who have businesses and trying to provide services to our clients. So we have internal clients, we have external clients, that we are able to do the best of our ability on a daily basis. And it does require review and continuous assessment, right? So I always tell people, look at the five W's and the 1H, who, what, when, where, how, why. Make sure you take those things into consideration and always assess and change as we need to on a daily basis. It's a daily it's a daily threat. The threat changes every day as persons are exposed more or less. Let's take this less. So I just want to reiterate that. And thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. Mr. Virgil?
Hi, I'd just like to thank the Bureau for hosting this webinar. I found it to be so important. Actually, a meeting running a bit late for, but I found this to be very important and really important to be here. So I'd like to thank you guys for having this webinar, and I'm glad that I was a part of it. If there's anything I just want to leave in parting, the mental health aspect of it, I think, was well ventilated today. So that that's something very important I would like organizations to really take forward with them in terms of looking at how we can measure it, tackle it, deal with it, take it seriously. And the other thing I really would like to see is a lot of data gathering as well and sharing of data. That's something that I think will go a long way for strengthening health and safety in general and trying to be able, from an organizational perspective as well as from a national perspective. I'm a big fan of evidence-based decisions, not just because it sounds good or feel good. Everything should be supported by evidence and data and a proper process. That's how you can evaluate something. You can't evaluate something if you don't have a plan, and you can't evaluate efficacy if you don't have the right data to do so. So that would just be my parting words. And again, I'm glad that I was invited to be here. And as I said, this was a really good webinar, and congratulations, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you, Christian. So I would turn it over now to Prem to give his closing statements.
Thanks a lot, Nadita. And I'd like to thank the Bureau as well for inviting us on this forum. Thanks to the participants for sitting in and listening to this critical conversation. But I think more so, I think there are a lot of lessons that we can learn, coming out of the pandemic or the COVID-19 or post-pandemic. And I think we should not lose the lessons learned from it, anticipating another event, in the near future or in the long-term future. So I think that focus on health, that focus on human behavior. We have seen the use of technology during this period to facilitate safe systems of work, whether it be emergency exercises, training programs. The learnings that come from that, I think, is very critical that we don't lose the effect of it post-pandemic. And we sort of use that as a momentum in building and continually improving our safe systems of work. So I think that is absolutely critical that we don't lose it. And we also share and collaborate amongst our peers and colleagues to a greater extent, of course, some of these lessons learned. So thank you very much on behalf of the.
Thank you, Prem. I will now go to Dr. Allen to give his closing.
Thank you for inviting the ministry. We're happy to participate in the event. I look at the number of participants that we had. Now I'm seeing 57, but I recall seeing around 70 plus. Right, so this is really indicative of the interest that is out there. So I really would want to celebrate these proactive efforts of these industries and persons and parties who are trying to do what they can do. And in this instance, to use another tool in the toolkit, the standard, to bring about safe workplaces so that there's less reliance on the coercive techniques and much more reliance on the upfront proactive efforts. So I celebrate that. I also agree with Mr. Virgil when he spoke about the importance of data. So there's really need to have formative data to drive policy, right? So you really need to look at creating more data and even for developing a research agenda. In closing also, we spoke a lot about the health aspects. So we need to close the gap on occupational health. Yeah, I spoke about the small H. So you need to see much more health risk assessments happening and much more health surveillance and the like. It's important to do that and to be assisted by medical practitioners who are environmentally literate, right? Also, there's need for even stronger collaboration with our stakeholders. In the standard, we refer to them as interested parties. So that collaboration is very important as we go forward. So we need to amplify that. There's copious guidance out there dealing with the health aspects of health and safety and COVID. Guidance from WHO, PAHO, WHO. Yeah, so you need to peg our actions, not just to the standards, but to the national and the international guidance that is there. And the last thing I want to say is that I think there's need to really seriously evaluate the impact of the national OSH policy and the suitability and sufficiency and the efficacy of the efforts and approaches of the policy implementation body. The first speaker spoke about 14, 15 years have passed to ensure that we are incrementally improving and safeguarding workers everywhere. Yeah, say thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Allen. So I'd like to bring the session to a close, and I'll start off with thanking all our panelists, the members of the National Technical Committee for participating in the session, as well as the OSH agency for the presentation, and also Ms. Erica Carut for standing in for our executive director, Mr. Derek Lukpat, who had another engagement. But TTBS is very pleased to collaborate with all stakeholders regarding the use of standards to support the occupational health and safety systems and issues that we are facing now. So on that note, I would like to thank all the participants for showing up today and being part of the session and raising questions, and the ability to share the information with stakeholders is something that we are very firmly committed to. And we will be following up with stakeholders regarding expanding the committee membership for the National Technical Committee. So I'd like to thank Ms. Andia Prasad Murad specifically, because she would have organized this webinar basically on her own. And she is also the technical secretary for the National Technical Committee. She will be in contact with the stakeholders and especially the participants regarding improvements to the existing standards. So Andia, if you'd like to, close off the session, because you are personally invested in this area.
Okay. Thank you, Nadita. And I'd also like to join in thanking our committee members and Plea and OSHA for jumping on board and helping us create this webinar to reach out to our stakeholders and how to create a safe and resilient workplace. And as Nadita was saying, we want to keep in touch. So we're encouraging participants to reach out to us. We'll also be reaching out to you with some information on our work on future standards, because safety isn't something that just stops now. It's a continual process, much like my plan, do, check, act system. So thank you, everyone. Do have a good lunch.
Okay, goodbye, everyone, and we'll be bringing the meeting to a
Goodbye.
close. So
Thank you,
look forward.
Andia.
Thank you. Bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye.